So if you're a regular viewer of Kit Guru, you'll know on the channel we often cover some of the latest and greatest high-end hardware. However, that's not for everyone, so there are occasions where we like to bring you reviews of cheaper, more affordable budget hardware. Today is one of those days because we're looking at a new budget case that costs under 80 euros. It comes with 4 ARGB fans and it supports some high-end hardware. But is it really good value for money? Let's find out.
Utilizing a 90-degree rotated motherboard layout, Ultra F2 carries the torch of Silverstone's stack effect, bottom to top directional airflow design legacy.
So the case we're talking about is the Chieftec Hunter 2, which is here. It is an updated version of the original Chieftec Hunter. It has some minor changes internally, and they are minor, as well as this new front panel design. In terms of pricing and availability, which it's a bit of a grey area, especially in the UK, there doesn't seem to be any retail outlets at the moment that has this in stock in the UK, and I'm unsure what pricing will look like in the UK if it does come to any UK retailers. But you can pick it up across Europe. Again, pricing is a bit up and down depending on where you look. It seems to be priced somewhere between 70 and 80 euros, which probably these days does put it in the lower budget market, but it's not as cheap as some cases that are available, such as cases from Aerocool and Cougar, which can be the real bottom end of the budget pricing. Doesn't mean that they're bad cases, but they are considerably below this. You can get some cases around 40, 50 pounds in the UK. I think this will be slightly more than that if it does come to the UK, but those cases across Europe are more like 50 euros and this is closer to 70 euros. So it is a budget case, but it's priced slightly higher than some of the real bargain basement cases there are out there. In terms of features, it includes 4 rainbow ARGB fans, 3 pre-installed in the front panel and 1 in the rear exhaust mount. It has a front panel with a mesh center and then 2 brushed aluminium trim panels either side. There's also the Chieftec logo at the bottom of that mesh. The tempered glass side panel is hinged for easy access and requires no tools to open or remove completely. It's equipped with an ARGB fan hub. On that fan hub there are 5 ARGB ports, so just standard 3-pin 5V ARGB connections. There's a couple of LED strip connections. There's also 1 Aura sync port on there and 5 3-pin voltage control fan connections as well. So the fans that come in the case, they're not PWM control, they are voltage control with standard 3-pin motherboard headers. In terms of front panel connectivity, there's a power button on there, reset button on the top of the case. There's also 2 buttons for controlling the ARGB lighting, one to control the mode, which you can use to skip through various different RGB effects and solid colors. And there's a second RGB button that controls the brightness of the LEDs on the fans. Looking at those, the RGB effects aren't bad. There's plenty of different effects and different solid colors to choose from, but the implementation of the RGB isn't perfect. You can see quite a bit of light bleed from around the fan hubs of the individual LEDs, and also the internal kind of framework or strengthening of the plastic hub. You can see that as well, which doesn't look great. In terms of connectivity on the front panel, there's a USB Type-C port and just 1 USB Type-A port. I would have liked to have seen at least 2 USB Type-A ports. I don't think that's enough in this day and age. There's also individual 3.5mm audio jacks for headphones and microphone. Changes between the original Hunter and the Hunter 2. The front panel has been updated. The mesh part of the front panel is larger in the Hunter 2 than it was in the original Hunter. The PSU shroud cutout window has gone. It's just a solid power supply shroud. The motherboard tray, the fans and the ARGB hub, they all look identical to the original Hunter, so I don't think there's any changes there. So let's take a closer look at the case and get the side panels off and have a look at some of the features and the hardware support. So we'll start with the tempered glass side panel. It is a hinged tempered glass side panel. I know a lot of you guys like the hinged tempered glass side panels, and there's just a little latch that you pull open and then you can swing the tempered glass and it just slides off the hinges, and I don't think there's any tint on that tempered glass at all. If there is, it is a very light tint. At the opposite side of the case, it's just a plain steel side panel. It's held on at the back with 2 thumb screws, one at the top and one at the bottom. These thumb screws, they're not captive, And then the side panel, it just slides backwards and drops off. And you can see that is just a plain steel side panel. There's no sound dampening material on this, and it is quite flexible, I'd say. That's probably because the steel that's using this, the sheet steel that's using this, is only 0.5 millimeters thick, which is quite thin, and you can feel it as well in the chassis. If you look at the chassis, there's quite a bit of flex in that chassis. It's got quite a cheap feel to it. It is a cheap case, so you've got to expect that, but it is quite flexible. There's some flex in the actual chassis frame and in the side panel. The front panel, as you can see, meshed down the center, and then there's these two strips of brushed aluminium. Chieftec logo at the bottom. This just come off, bit of a pull from the bottom, and then that panel is removed, and you can see it's mostly plastic with those brushed aluminium strips, and then this is a steel perforated mesh in the middle there. That could potentially come out. It's got some little flaps that you know, just bend back. That could come out for cleaning, but it's not really necessary. There's no additional dust filter there. The front mesh acts as a dust filter, and you can see behind the mesh are three pre-installed 120mm ARGB fans. These are the Chieftec SF1225 RGB C1, the same fans that came in the original Chieftec Hunter. You get three in the front and one pre-installed in the rear of the case. As you can tell, it is quite a compact ATX case. Dimensions are 484 by 210 by 464. Quite compact compared to some other mid-towers. It supports up to ATX motherboard format, so that includes ATX, micro ATX and mini ATX, no eATX support. In terms of cooling, so at the front you can fit either 320mm or 240mm fans, or officially only up to a 280mm radiator. However, I have tried a few different 360mm AIO radiators, and they seem to fit in there perfectly fine without any major stress or worries of contacting anything and causing any interference with other hardware. So I'm not sure why Chieftec has left that out. I thought that would be a good feature to add in, and it is missing from the official specs from the overview on the website. I've not tried every single AIO on the market and every 360mm AIO, but I'd say half a dozen that I've tried, including Corsair, NZXT and some Thermaltake AIOs. They all seem to fit in. The 360mm radiators seem to fit in. Up top you can either fit 220 or 240mm fans. There's also a removable dust filter at the top of the case. It's just one of those perforated steel with magnet dust filters, very flexible. The top of the case is otherwise very open once that dust filter is removed. There's no radiator support up top because the space between the top of the case and where the motherboard would sit, there just isn't enough room for that. And VRM contact with possibly with memory and things like that will be an issue. So again, that's not officially supported. However, you might find with certain motherboard and AIO configurations that you can fit at least a 240mm AIO up there, but it will be a tight squeeze. At the back of the case, there's only a 120mm fan mount. Potentially, again, you could fit a 120mm radiator or AIO there. There is 7 PCIe slots, and these are those really cheap kind of punch out slot covers that aren't really replaceable. And this is a bit of a cost saving measure. Not something I like to see. I'd have thought on a case that is €70 or maybe £70, you would have replaceable or refittable PCIe slot covers. A large area of the top of the power supply shroud that is vented and open with mesh. I notice on there are some fan mounting points as well for 120mm fans. It looks like there's 2 of them, but again, these aren't listed in the official specs, not shown in the overview on the Chieftec website, but it does look like there's space there for 220mm fans, potentially allowing for more airflow to your graphics card. And again, I don't understand why this has been left off the spec sheet if it is available. As I mentioned previously, on the Hunter 2, the power supply shroud covers the full length of the case. The original Hunter that had a power supply window cut out here where you could see the logo of the power supply. I'm glad that's like that rather than with the window. I'm not really a fan of those windows. They're not always in the right position. Sometimes the label on the power supply, or the logo on the label, is upside down. There are plenty of cable management cutouts, so there's 3 along the top of the power supply shroud. They all look to be in the positions where you would expect. A couple up at the top of the motherboard tray. There is one more at the front there where the front I/O cables pass through. You could potentially use that to pass some fan cables through. There's 3 down the side of the motherboard tray here, and these have rubber grommets in, which is good to see those in at this price point. As I say, the motherboard tray supports up to ATX motherboards, as well as micro ATX and mini ITX. Maximum graphics card length is 320mm long. That's without a front radiator installed. Maximum CPU cooler height is 170mm tall, which sounds pretty decent for a case in this price range, and maximum power supply size is ATX up to 180mm. At the back of the case is a 120mm fan mount, cut out for the motherboard rear I/O, 7 PCIe slots, and then the power supply cut out at the bottom. It's not one of those that you remove and insert the power supply from the back. You have to insert the power supply from the side and then screw it in from the back. Around the right hand side of the case, or what some people call the back of the case, you can see a couple of those cutouts up at the top, and then some down the side of the motherboard tray with rubber grommets. On here you've also got 2 2.5-inch SSD mounts. These are just held on with thumb screws, so you just remove the thumb screws. Again, they're not captive, and then the brackets just slide up. Just screw your SSD drive to that, slot that back in place and secure it back in with the screws. Also at the back here is the 5-port ARGB hub, and as I said, there is 5 3-pin 5-volt ARGB ports on there. There's an Aura Sync port, 2 LED strip ports, and then 5 fan ports. That is just powered by a single SATA power connection, so just plug that into your power supply and you'll be able to control it with the buttons on the front. Underneath the power supply shroud there's another storage bay, so on there you can either fit 2 3.5-inch drives, or you can fit a 3.5-inch and a 2.5-inch, so potentially you could fit 3 2.5-inch drives, 2 on the sleds, 1 on the bay, and a 3.5-inch drive, or you could fit 2 3.5-inch drives on the bay and 2 on these 2.5-inch drive sleds. One thing worth mentioning initially about this side of the case, there's only about 90mm of space between the side panel and the motherboard tray. So if you get a lot of RGB fans and more hubs and things like that in here, you might have a bit of difficulty managing cables and stopping any potential bulging of the side panel. But I think if you're quite a basic system, it should just be enough. I'd like to see more like 25mm minimum, but it's just 19mm in the Hunter 2. So officially, it's up to 180mm ATX power supplies that are supported in the Hunter 2, but this drive bay that's on the floor of the case, that is removable. You just take out a couple of thumb screws from the case floor and then you can take that drive bay out, which means potentially then you've got the full length of the power supply shroud for a power supply and for cable management. So technically you should be able to fit in power supplies longer than 180mm. Then onto the floor of the case. There are 4 feet on the floor of the case. They've got what look like foam anti-vibration pads. The feet are about 25mm tall, so it gives a bit of ground clearance and will allow for some airflow into the power supply. Here you can see there is a dust filter. It's one of those really cheap, really thin bits of perforated steel dust filter that just hold into these tabs. Can be bent quite easily, these, and actually break quite easily. There is then a larger mesh area for the power supply fan. Here you can see the screws for that drive bay, so if you just remove those 2 screws, again these are not captive screws, and then give that a bit of a yank, that comes out, and as I say, that increases the potential space you've got in there for power supply. Also potentially allows you to slide a radiator down past the power supply shroud and it won't interfere with the radiator if you slide it down there. For the test system specification, it's an Intel Core i7-12700K CPU. Motherboard is an MSI Meg Z690 Unify. Graphics is the INNO3D RTX 4080 iCHILL X3. Memory is 32GB, 2x 16GB modules of crucial DDR5 Pro 5600 megatransfers per second. Storage is a 1TB Corsair MP600 PCIe Gen 4 NVMe M.2 SSD. Power supply is the Seasonic Focus GX1000 80 Plus Gold, ATX3 and PCIe 5 ready. Chassis is obviously the Chieftec Hunter 2, and the CPU cooler is the Cooler Master 240 Atmos AIO. You'll notice that's installed in the top of the case, which technically isn't supported by the case if you look at the official specifications, but as you can see, it's fitted there, and to be honest, no problem really at all fitting it. Just have to make sure you connect up all the cables to the top of the motherboard first, such as the EPS and any fan cables, before you put that in position. Would have been ideal if this case had a removable top panel, and if you did forget to plug in any cables up at the top, then you'd just be able to unscrew the top panel and lift it out slightly to do that. However, as I say, AIO installation at the top isn't officially supported, so that's probably one of the reasons why the top panel isn't removable. To test the thermal performance of the Chieftec Hunter 2, we ran our usual thermal performance test, which includes a combined Cinebench R23 and 3D Mark Speedway stress test ran simultaneously for 30 minutes. You can find the full testing methodology over on the KitGuru website. The Chieftec Hunter 2 does an okay job of keeping high-end components cool. The 12700K sits happily at around 50 degrees C average delta under heavy load. It's not quite as good as some other cases that we have tested with this CPU, but considering it's only a 240mm AIO cooling the CPU, it's fine. GPU temperature is acceptable with the case in its default configuration. However, removing the tempered glass side panel allows for more GPU airflow, which means that the GPU runs cooler and quieter. So there is some restriction from the front panel. Adding fans to the power supply shroud also provides a significant improvement in GPU core temperature, but overall the Hunter 2 does a decent job of cooling the high-end test system that we used. Included accessories that come with the case: you get a bag of screws for motherboard, standoffs, power supply and things like that, installing a graphics card, a user guide and installation manual, an ARGB sync cable, so that's for connecting from the hub to the motherboard if you want to synchronize with motherboard RGB lighting. Then a few ties for cable management, but the strange thing with these is they're not proper locking zip ties. They're just those twist ties that you'd get like with sandwich bags. Really bad quality. I never thought that zip ties were an expensive or luxury accessory that comes with a case. Can't understand why some proper zip ties aren't included. And to be fair, cable management, you do need quite a lot of zip ties to make it look good around the right hand side of the case, if that's what you're into. So I feel that's a bit poor, just adding those twist ties, but quite nicely leads me on to some of the thoughts and issues I've got with the case, and that is kind of the theme amongst these issues. The build quality is quite poor. It's very thin sheet steel, 0.5mm thick, which means there's a lot of flex in the chassis, as I showed you earlier, and a lot of flex in some of the side panels. The tempered glass side panel, it's only approximately 2 to 2.5mm thick. Again, it doesn't feel like great quality, it doesn't look like great quality, and also the way that it shuts, it's quite abruptly shuts if you push it, and it bounces back. The catches aren't brilliant on it either. The alignment of the motherboard standoffs isn't perfect. 6 of the motherboard standoffs come pre-installed, but you have to put 3 of the standoffs in yourself, and when you screw them in, they don't line up perfectly. They're a bit off at an angle. And one of the motherboard standoffs, it actually interferes with the ARGB hub. So it kind of pushes the ARGB hub out. If you pull it out of its position, the ARGB hub, it's impossible to slot it back into the slots when that motherboard standoff is in place. One of the cutouts at the top corner of the case, it's a bit small, it's quite difficult to thread 2 EPS power cables through. These cutouts down the side of the motherboard tray, again, they're quite small, it's awkward just pushing through the 24 pin cable. The important features that are missing from the official specs, I can't understand at all why Chieftec has missed those out of the official spec list and the overview on their official website, such as the 360mm front radiator. According to the official specs, only 280mm radiators are supported at the front of the case. Quite clearly, you can see that I've tested 360mm radiators and they fit in fine. It will reduce the length of graphics card fitting a radiator at the front, but that's the same with the 280 or a 360 anyway. Either would reduce graphics card length, so I don't understand why that's been missing off the spec sheet. And top radiator installation, according to the official specs, there's no support for top radiators. And again, you can quite clearly see there's a 240mm AIO, 240mm radiator installed there quite happily, works well. It's not difficult to install. Yes, it makes access to some of the cables at the top of the motherboard difficult, but with this configuration it works. Maybe with some other motherboards and other AIOs you might run into problems. 280mm AIO at the top will be tight to VRM heatsinks and things like that, but again, don't understand why that's been missed off the official specs. And it's almost as if the company is doubting its own products and what it can support and what it can do. So I reached out to Chieftec about the lack of 360mm radiator support. They've looked at it again internally and updated the official specs and their website to include front 360mm radiator support now. Also, the overall quality of the case, as I say, with the thin steel that it's made from, the cheap dust filters and the tempered glass side panel that feels quite cheap. Reminds me of one of those old cases that you used to buy in the late 90s or the early 2000s that came with like a free power supply. The quality of it seems really low for the price. There are better cases out there that are far cheaper than this at 70 or 80 euros, whatever the official MSRP is. Does feel like a little too much. But it does come with those 4 ARGB fans. They're not PWM control, they are voltage control, which is a little disappointing. It also comes with that 5-port ARGB and fan control hub. Thermal performance is okay. You can install a pretty high-end system, like you see with the one we've used for the test system here. And it's not too difficult to install a system inside those minor issues with the cable cutouts and things like that. But the system looks pretty good once it's installed, up and running with all the ARGB lighting effects running. I wouldn't say that this is a case that's going to be popular with enthusiasts, but you can imagine system integrators liking this case. I wouldn't consider this as a true enthusiast case because of those issues with the build quality and some of the limitations with the installation and the hardware. So thanks for watching this review of the Chieftec Hunter 2. If you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button if you're not already subscribed to Kit Guru. If you enjoy what we do here at Kit Guru and you want to help support us, you can always head over to our store, pick up some merch, or you could subscribe to our Patreon. And as always, if you want to catch up on all the in-depth technical reviews, head over to the website.